The candle on the registrar's desk had already burned halfway down when Duke Alistair Ravenswood realized something was wrong with the papers in front of him. He had signed dozens of documents that week: debt agreements, land transfers, letters of condolence he barely had the strength to write after burying his father only 11 days earlier. So when Lord Edmund Ashworth placed the marriage contract before him with a steady hand and an even steadier smile, Alistair did not read every line as carefully as he should have. He should have, because the name written in careful ink at the bottom of the page was not Seraphina Ashworth, the daughter he had agreed to marry 6 months earlier during a quiet conversation over brandy and old family debts. The name was Wren Ashworth, her younger sister, a woman Alistair had met perhaps twice in his life, and never for longer than the length of a greeting. By the time he noticed, the registrar had already stamped the seal. Witnesses from both households had already signed their names beneath his. The betrothal was no longer a private arrangement between two families. It was law, recognized by the Crown's office, binding in every way that mattered. Alistair set down his pen very slowly. "Lord Ashworth," he said, keeping his voice level though his pulse had begun to hammer against his collar. "This contract bears the wrong name." Edmund Ashworth did not flinch. He folded his hands over the head of his walking cane and regarded the Duke with the calm patience of a man who had already won something, and was simply waiting for the other party to notice. "Does it, Your Grace?" "You know it does. I agreed to marry Seraphina." "You agreed to marry into my family," Edmund said smoothly. "The contract names the bride. It has always named Wren." It was, of course, not true. Alistair remembered the conversation clearly, remembered Seraphina's face across the dinner table, her practiced elegance, the way she had already begun speaking of wedding dates as though the matter were settled. But he also understood, in that instant, exactly what kind of trap he had walked into. To challenge Edmund Ashworth publicly would mean dragging both families into scandal weeks after his father's death, at the exact moment his political enemies were circling his weakened title like wolves scenting blood. An annulment fight, aired before the court and the newspapers, would finish what his father's illness and the estate's crushing debts had already begun. It would be the end of Ravenswood. Alistair looked at the paper again, at the name that was not the one he had chosen. "Where is she?" he asked quietly. "Wren, waiting in the carriage outside," Edmund said. "She has agreed to the match. She understands her duty." Alistair doubted very much that anyone had asked Wren whether she understood anything at all. But there was no undoing what had already been sealed, and a duke who broke a marriage contract before it had even begun would not survive the season that followed, not with the state his finances were in. He stood, buttoned his coat, and walked to the carriage himself, because if he was going to be bound to a stranger for the rest of his life, he intended to at least look her in the eye before the ride home. She was younger than he expected, though not by much. 20, perhaps 21. Her dress was plainer than her sister's would have been, her dark hair pulled back with none of the elaborate styling Alistair associated with the Ashworth household. She did not look away when he opened the carriage door. She looked directly at him, and there was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at having secured a duke. There was only a kind of tired wariness, as though she had spent her whole life bracing for disappointment, and had simply decided, once again, to brace for more. "You didn't choose me," she said, before he could speak at all. It was not a question. Alistair considered lying, considered offering some gentle diplomatic phrase to smooth over the moment, the way he had been trained to do since childhood. But grief and exhaustion had worn the patience for pretense out of him. "No," he admitted, "I didn't." Something flickered across her face, gone almost as fast as it appeared, not hurt, exactly. She seemed too practiced at concealing hurt for it to show so plainly. It was closer to confirmation, as though she had expected this answer and was relieved, in some strange way, not to be lied to. "Then we understand each other," Wren said, and turned to look out the carriage window at the grey London sky. "That will make this easier." Alistair climbed in beside her, and the carriage rolled forward toward a marriage neither of them had asked for, toward a manor house heavy with debt and grief, and toward a future that would look nothing like either of them expected. The road to Ravenswood took the better part of 2 days, and for most of it, Wren said very little. Alistair used the silence to study her without appearing to, the way he had once studied opposing negotiators in Parliament, searching for tells, for weaknesses, for some sign of what he was dealing with. She did not fidget. She did not fill the quiet with nervous chatter the way he had expected a young woman thrust unwillingly into a grand marriage might. She simply watched the countryside pass, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap, as though she had long ago mastered the art of appearing calm, regardless of what stormed beneath the surface. It was only on the second evening, when their carriage stopped at a coaching inn to change horses, that she spoke to him directly again. "My sister would have known what to say to you by now," she said, not looking at him. "She would have charmed you, complimented your estate before she'd even seen it, asked about your father in exactly the right tone of sympathy." "I don't want charm," Alistair said. "I've had enough of people telling me what I want to hear this month." Wren finally turned to look at him, and for the first time, something like curiosity crossed her face. "Then what do you want?" He thought about the question longer than he expected to. "Honesty," he said finally, "even when it's inconvenient." "That," Wren said, "I can give you." It was not warmth between them, not yet. But it was the first true agreement they had reached, and Alistair found himself, unexpectedly, looking forward to the rest of the journey. Ravenswood Manor rose out of the mist just after noon on the third day, its grey stone towers streaked with the damp of a wet spring, its gardens overgrown in places where his father's illness had made maintenance a luxury the estate could no longer afford. Alistair watched Wren's face as the carriage rolled up the long drive, waiting for judgment, for disappointment at the state of the house she was now bound to. Instead, she leaned toward the window, studying the structure with something closer to interest than dismay. "It needs work," she said simply. "But it has good bones." It was such an odd thing to say, so unlike anything Serafina would have offered, that Alistair almost laughed for the first time in weeks. The household staff gathered at the entrance to receive them, a smaller number than the manor had once employed, another casualty of the estate's debts. Alistair introduced Wren as his Duchess, watched the staff exchange careful glances at the unfamiliar name, and understood that word of the switched sisters had likely already begun to spread through Ashworth circles, whispered behind fans at dinner parties he had not yet attended. Let them whisper, he thought. There was nothing to be done about it now. That night, alone in his study with the estate ledgers spread across his desk, Alistair allowed himself, for the first time since the registrar's office, to sit with the full weight of what had happened. He had married a stranger, not the woman he had chosen, not even a woman he particularly knew, but a stranger who had walked into his ruined household with more composure than he currently possessed himself. He did not yet understand what kind of woman Wren Ashworth truly was. He did not yet know that within a matter of months she would become the only person in his life who told him the truth without softening it, who challenged him without fear of his title, who saw the man beneath the debts and the grief, and refused to let him hide from either. He knew only that the marriage he had never asked for had already begun to feel less like a mistake and more like the opening chapter of something he could not yet name. Outside his window, the gardens of Ravenswood lay tangled and neglected beneath the spring rain, waiting, like the rest of the estate, for someone patient enough to bring them back to life. Alistair closed the ledger, extinguished the candle, and went to bed thinking, for the first time in a long while, not of his losses, but of the quiet, unexpected steadiness in a stranger's eyes. He did not yet know her, but something told him he would want to. The following morning, Wren rose before the household staff expected her to, dressed simply, and began walking the halls of Ravenswood on her own, taking stock of a home that was now, however strangely, hers. She found neglected rooms with dust sheets draped over furniture too fine to have been forgotten, a kitchen running on a staff far too small for a house this size, and account books left carelessly open in the study, revealing debts far worse than she had been told before the wedding. She did not panic. She had grown up the overlooked daughter in a household where every resource, every ounce of attention, had gone toward preparing her sister for exactly this kind of life. While Serafina had been taught to dance and charm and dazzle, Wren had been left largely to her own devices, and in that neglect she had quietly taught herself things no one thought to value. How to manage a household on very little, how to read a ledger, how to notice what others overlooked. It was, she realized as she stood in the doorway of Ravenswood's disordered study, the first time any of it might actually matter. When Alistair found her there an hour later, sleeves pushed back, comparing two account books with a look of quiet concentration, he stopped in the doorway, uncertain whether to interrupt. "These figures don't match," Wren said, without looking up. "The steward's ledger and the household accounts. Someone has been skimming, or something has been miscounted for months." Alistair crossed the room and looked over her shoulder, and for the first time since his father's death, he felt the smallest flicker of relief. Not because the discovery was good news, it was not, but because, for the first time in weeks, he was not the only person carrying the weight of his crumbling estate. "Show me," he said, and pulled up a chair beside her. They worked through the ledgers together until the candles burned low, and though neither of them said it aloud, something had shifted quietly between them. Not romance, not yet, but the first thread of respect, spun in the unglamorous work of saving a household neither of them had expected to inherit together. It was a beginning neither of them had chosen, but it was, undeniably, a beginning. 3 weeks into the marriage, Wren stood in the middle of the Ravenswood kitchen at dawn, sleeves rolled up, directing 2 exhausted maids and a cook who had not been paid on time in nearly a month. The estate steward, a heavy-set man named Mr. Whitmore who had served the Ravenswood family for over 20 years, watched her with open skepticism from the doorway. "Your Grace," he said, using her title with a faint edge that suggested he did not yet believe she had earned it. "The household accounts are not typically a duchess's concern." "They are when no one else is watching them properly," Wren replied, not looking up from the supply list in her hands. "You've been ordering twice the flour this house needs and paying above market rate for candles. Either explain it to me, or I'll ask Mr. Pell to explain it to the Duke instead." Whitmore's jaw tightened. Mr. Pell was the family solicitor, a sharp, careful man who had begun quietly reviewing the estate's finances at Wren's request, rather than Alistair's, a fact that had not gone unnoticed among the staff. Whitmore excused himself without another word, and by the following week, the household's expenses had dropped by a noticeable margin. Word of these small victories traveled quickly through Ravenswood's staff, the way such things always did in a large household. The maids began to speak of the new duchess with quiet approval, impressed by a woman who noticed their long hours and unpaid wages when the previous mistress of the house, in the final years of the old duke's illness, had noticed very little at all. Bridget, the young housemaid who had been with the family since childhood, became something close to an ally, bringing Wren small pieces of household gossip that proved, more often than not, useful. Alistair noticed the change too, though he said little about it at first. He noticed it in the way the household ran more smoothly, in the way tradesmen who had once treated Ravenswood's unpaid accounts with open contempt began extending credit again, reassured by the new duchess's careful attention to every bill. He noticed it, most of all, in the way Wren addressed him directly, without the careful deference most of the aristocracy offered a duke, and without the flattery he had grown weary of receiving from everyone else in his life. It unsettled him at first. He was not accustomed to being challenged. "You disagree with the tenant rent increase," he said one evening, finding her in the study reviewing correspondence he had drafted that afternoon. "I do," Wren said simply. "You're raising rents on families who are already struggling after last year's poor harvest. You'll gain a little money this quarter and lose their loyalty for years. That's a poor trade. The estate needs the income. The estate needs tenants who don't resent you enough to let the land fail out of spite," Wren said. "There's a difference between managing debt and punishing the people beneath you for having none of your problems." Alistair opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He turned the letter over in his hands, reading it once more with her words in his ears, and found, to his quiet irritation, that she was right. He revised the letter that night, lowering the proposed increase to something the tenants could reasonably manage, and said nothing further about it to Wren. But the following week, when the tenant families sent a modest gift of thanks to the manor, a basket of preserves and fresh bread, he left it on her desk without comment, and she understood, without needing him to say it, that it was as close to an apology and a thank you as he was currently capable of giving. These moments accumulated slowly, the way trust often does, built not from grand gestures but from small, repeated proof that the other person could be relied upon. Alistair began seeking Wren's opinion before finalizing estate decisions. Not because propriety demanded it, but because her judgment had proven sound, more often than his own advisors. Wren, in turn, began to see past the cold, dutiful exterior Alistair presented to the world, glimpsing instead a man exhausted by grief and responsibility, doing his best to hold together an inheritance that seemed determined to collapse beneath him. It was during a quiet dinner in early summer, just the two of them at the long dining table that had once seated a much larger family, that Alistair spoke of his father for the first time since the wedding. "He knew the estate was failing for years," Alistair said, turning his wine glass slowly between his fingers. "He never told me. I found out everything from the ledgers after he died, all those years, and he let me believe we were simply cautious with money, not drowning in debt." "Why do you think he hid it?" Wren asked gently. "Pride, probably. Or he thought he had more time to fix it himself." Alistair's jaw tightened. He was wrong on both counts. Wren was quiet for a moment. "My mother did something similar," she said finally. "Not with money. With illness. She was sick for nearly a year before she told any of us, because she didn't want to be a burden while Serafina was preparing for her first season. By the time we knew, there was very little anyone could do." Alistair looked at her properly then, surprised by the confession, by the small crack in her usual composure. "I didn't know that. Most people don't ask," Wren said. "They assume because I'm the younger sister that there's less to know." It was the first time either of them had offered the other something truly personal, unguarded by duty or negotiation. And the conversation that followed stretched long past when the candles should have been extinguished, two people slowly discovering that the stranger across the table understood grief in a way few others in their gilded, guarded world seemed to. It was into this fragile, newly forming trust that Serafina Ashworth arrived, uninvited but perfectly timed, at the start of the following week. She came dressed in pale blue silk, her golden hair arranged with the effortless precision that had made her the most admired debutante of her season, and she embraced Wren at the entrance of Ravenswood, with an affection that looked, to any outside observer, entirely genuine. "I simply had to see how my sister was settling in," Serafina said, her voice warm, her eyes flicking briefly, assessingly, toward Alistair. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. I know it's unconventional, but family is family." Alistair, raised to extend hospitality regardless of personal feeling, offered her a polite welcome and instructed the staff to prepare a guest room. He told himself, as he watched the sisters walk arm in arm toward the garden, that there was nothing sinister in a sister's visit, that his instinctive wariness was simply the lingering suspicion of a man who had been deceived once already by the Ashworth family. He was not entirely wrong to be wary. Over dinner that evening, Serafina was every bit as charming as her reputation suggested, drawing Alistair into easy conversation about mutual acquaintances, complimenting the improvements already visible in the household, laughing warmly at small jokes with a practiced grace that Wren, watching quietly from across the table, recognized as an old and familiar performance. "You've done wonders here already," Serafina told Wren later, once Alistair had excused himself to his study. "Though I confess I never imagined you managing a household of this size. You always preferred your books to company." "People change when they need to," Wren said evenly. "Of course." Serafina smiled, but something calculating flickered behind her eyes. "It's simply funny, isn't it? How things turned out. I was meant to be the Duchess. Everyone expected it, and instead, here you are." "Here I am," Wren agreed, refusing to rise to whatever bait her sister was laying. "I only mean," Serafina continued, her tone still light, still sisterly, "that it must be strange for him. Married to someone he never chose. Men like the Duke are raised to want very particular things, Wren. Elegance, pedigree, a wife who knows how to move through society without stumbling. I do hope, for your sake, that he doesn't come to resent the mistake too deeply." The words landed exactly where Serafina intended them to, quiet and precise, a small poisoned seed planted beneath the guise of sisterly concern. Wren said nothing in response, refusing to give her sister the satisfaction of a visible reaction. But that night, alone in her chambers, the words echoed longer than she wanted them to. She thought of Alistair's careful politeness at dinner, the way he had laughed more easily with Serafina in one evening than he often did with her in a week, and wondered, despite every instinct telling her not to trust the thought, whether her sister was simply saying aloud what Alistair himself had never had the cruelty to voice. Serafina's visit, meant to last only a few days, stretched into nearly 2 weeks, filled with small moments engineered with the precision of a woman who had spent her entire life learning how to be irresistible. She offered to help plan an upcoming dinner for visiting dignitaries, insisting it was simply her way of being useful to her sister, though the plans she suggested consistently placed her at Alistair's side during the most important conversations, while positioning Wren toward quieter, less consequential corners of the gathering. Wren noticed. She said nothing, not yet certain whether she was witnessing deliberate manipulation or simply her sister's lifelong habit of occupying every room's center of attention without meaning any particular harm by it. But the uncertainty gnawed at her regardless, a small and growing unease that settled itself quietly beside the fragile trust she had begun building with her husband, threatening, in ways she could not yet fully name, to unravel everything they had carefully built. The dinner for the visiting dignitaries arrived on a warm evening in midsummer, and Ravenswood's dining hall had been restored, for the first time in years, to something resembling its former grandeur. Fresh flowers filled the vases Wren had personally selected. The silver had been polished by staff who took quiet pride in a household finally worth the effort again. Lord Hartwell, a senior diplomat whose favor Alistair badly needed to secure a trade concession vital to the estate's recovery, arrived with his wife and 2 junior officials, and for the first hour, the evening proceeded exactly as it should. Then Serafina, seated beside Lord Hartwell at her own quiet insistence during the seating arrangements, began to steer the conversation with the skill of a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of appearing helpful while causing harm. "Wren has always been the quiet one in our family," she said, laughing lightly, as though sharing an endearing family story. Our father used to worry she'd never manage a household of her own, given how little interest she showed in these sorts of gatherings growing up. It's remarkable, really, how well she's adapted." Lord Hartwell chuckled politely, unaware of the blade hidden inside the compliment. Wren, seated across the table, kept her expression pleasant, though she recognized immediately what her sister was doing, laying groundwork, brick by careful brick, for something larger. "I understand your family's estate borders the northern trade routes," Hartwell said, turning the conversation toward Alistair's business interests. "Your Grace, I trust the new Duchess is well acquainted with the region's customs. I recall some confusion regarding the Ashworth lineage some years back. A cousin's claim, was it not, disputed by the local magistrate?" The table went quiet for the space of a single heartbeat. Alistair felt his stomach tighten, uncertain what Hartwell was referring to, but aware, from the careful way Seraphina's smile did not waver, that this question had not arrived by accident. "I'm not certain what claim you mean, Lord Hartwell," Alistair said carefully. "Oh, it's likely nothing," Seraphina interjected smoothly, before Hartwell could elaborate. "Simply old gossip, I'm sure. Something about whether Wren's line of the family was properly recognized before our grandfather's passing. I never paid it much attention myself. Family disputes over inheritance are so tediously common, aren't they?" It was a masterstroke of cruelty disguised as dismissal. By waving the rumor away so lightly, Seraphina ensured it would linger in every mind at the table far longer than if she had stated it outright. Lord Hartwell's expression shifted subtly, the polite curiosity of a diplomat scenting a story worth remembering, worth repeating later in circles where such things mattered a great deal, circles where a duchess's legitimacy could quietly poison an entire trade negotiation. Wren set down her fork with deliberate calm, though her pulse had begun racing beneath her composed exterior. She had never heard of any dispute regarding her family's lineage, and she suspected, with a cold certainty settling in her chest, that no such dispute had ever existed at all. "I'm afraid my sister is mistaken," Wren said, her voice even and clear enough to carry down the table without seeming defensive. "There has never been any dispute over our family's standing. Perhaps she's confusing our family with another." "Perhaps," Seraphina said lightly, though her eyes held Wren's for just a moment longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that confirmed everything Wren had begun to suspect. The dinner continued, the conversation steered carefully back toward safer topics by Alistair, who spoke with a practiced ease that revealed nothing of the alarm building beneath his composed exterior. But the damage, subtle as it was, had already been done. By the time the guests departed that evening, Lord Hartwell's parting words to Alistair carried a faint, unmistakable coolness that had not been present at the evening's start. "A pleasure, Your Grace," Hartwell said, shaking his hand at the door. "Do give my regards to your father-in-law. I understand he handles these family matters with great discretion." The comment was a small thing, easily overlooked by anyone not paying close attention, but Alistair understood it exactly for what it was, a polite acknowledgement that the rumor, however baseless, had already begun its work. That night, once the guests had gone and the household had finally settled into silence, Alistair found Wren alone in the library, staring at nothing in particular, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Tell me honestly," he said, closing the door behind him. "Is there any truth to what your sister said?" Wren looked up at him sharply, and for a moment, the hurt in her expression was unmistakable, raw and unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. "You're asking me that," she said quietly, "after everything we've built these past months?" "I'm asking because a diplomat I need for this estate's survival just left this house believing there's a question over your family's legitimacy," Alistair said, his frustration bleeding into his voice, though it was directed less at Wren than at the entire situation closing in around them. "I need to know what I'm dealing with." "There is nothing to deal with," Wren said, standing now, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt she could no longer fully contain. "My sister invented that story tonight, in front of your guests, because she cannot stand watching me have something she believes should have been hers. And instead of recognizing that, you're standing here asking me to defend myself against a lie she created." The truth of her words settled over Alistair slowly, cutting through the fog of political anxiety that had clouded his judgment since the moment Hartwell had first spoken. He thought back over the evening, over Seraphina's carefully timed comment, the practiced lightness with which she had planted doubt, and then waved it away, ensuring it would take root regardless. He thought of the weeks before, of small comments dropped so casually he had barely registered them as anything other than sisterly affection, comments that had, he now realized, consistently painted Wren as somehow lesser, somehow less deserving of the position she now held. "I'm sorry," Alistair said, and meant it fully. You're right, I should have recognized what she was doing before tonight. You should have, Wren agreed, though some of the tension in her shoulders eased slightly at the admission. But recognizing it now still matters. Alistair crossed the room and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. I'll speak with Hartwell myself. Correct the record before it spreads any further. That may not be enough, Wren said. My sister doesn't create these situations carelessly. If she planted this tonight, it's because she intends for it to grow into something larger. She was right, though neither of them yet understood the full scope of what Serafina had set into motion. Over the following days, the rumor of a disputed Ashworth lineage began circulating quietly through London's aristocratic circles, carried by guests who had attended the dinner and repeated Hartwell's careful, deniable phrasing to friends eager for fresh gossip. By the end of the week, Alistair received a carefully worded letter from a colleague in Parliament, inquiring, with false casualness, whether the rumors regarding his Duchess's family held any truth, given the implications for certain pending trade agreements that required unquestionable legitimacy from all parties involved. The pressure mounted swiftly, and Alistair found himself fielding careful questions at every social engagement, deflecting inquiries with practiced diplomatic skill, while privately seething at how effectively his sister-in-law had turned a single dinner conversation into a genuine threat to his estate's recovery. It was Mr. Pell, the family solicitor, who uncovered the truth a week later, after Alistair requested a full review of the Ashworth family's legal history to settle the matter once and for all. There's no dispute, Your Grace, Pell reported, laying a folder of documents across Alistair's desk. None whatsoever. The family's lineage has been unbroken and unquestioned for 4 generations. I found no record of any claim, disputed or otherwise, matching what was described at your dinner. Then where did it come from? Alistair asked, though he already suspected the answer. I made some discreet inquiries among the household staff who overheard portions of the evening, Pell said carefully. It seems Lady Serafina mentioned the story to a lady's maid earlier that same day, describing it as something she intended to raise at dinner. The maid assumed it was simply idle conversation and thought nothing further of it until I asked. The confirmation settled over Alistair like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples of anger through him that took considerable effort to control. Serafina had not stumbled into causing harm through careless gossip. She had planned it, deliberately, days in advance, choosing the exact moment and the exact audience most likely to cause lasting damage to her own sister's marriage and Alistair's political standing. He found Wren in the garden that afternoon, tending to the roses that had begun, under her careful attention, to bloom again after years of neglect. Pell found the truth, Alistair said, and relayed what the solicitor had discovered. Wren's hands stilled over the roses, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, absorbing the confirmation of what she had already suspected but had hoped, against her better judgment, was not entirely true. She's my sister, Wren said finally, her voice quiet. I spent years believing she simply didn't notice me, that I was invisible to her the way I was invisible to most people in our family. I never imagined she disliked me enough to do something like this. This isn't about you, Alistair said gently, kneeling beside her among the roses. Not entirely. I think this is about her losing something she believed was owed to her, and being unable to accept that loss gracefully. That doesn't make it hurt less. No, Alistair agreed, it doesn't. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, her fingers still faintly stained with garden soil, and for a long moment they simply sat together in the quiet. 2 people who had begun as strangers bound by obligation and had slowly, carefully, become something neither of them had expected to find in the other. I'm going to correct this, Alistair said finally, publicly. I won't let her rumor stand unanswered any longer. That will mean confronting her, Wren said, and by extension, your father-in-law. He won't take kindly to being challenged. I'm aware, Alistair said, and there was a new steadiness in his voice, a resolve that had not been present when he first arrived at the marriage as a duty to be endured. But I'd rather face his displeasure than watch you carry the weight of a lie your own sister invented. The following week, at a gathering hosted by Lord Hartwell himself, meant to smooth over the lingering diplomatic tension, Alistair stood before the assembled guests and addressed the rumor directly, calmly, and without hesitation, presenting Pell's documentation as proof of the Ashworth family's unbroken and legitimate lineage. He did not name Serafina directly, choosing instead the more diplomatic path of correcting the record without escalating into open scandal, but every person in the room who had heard the original rumor understood precisely where it had originated, and precisely who had been vindicated by its correction. Serafina, present at the gathering, maintained her composed smile throughout Alistair's address, though the color had drained noticeably from her face by its conclusion. She approached Wren afterward, in a quiet corner away from the other guests, her voice low and sharp beneath its practiced pleasantness. "You've made your point," Serafina said. "Congratulations. You have your duke, your title, and now his public defense as well. I hope it was worth whatever remains of our relationship." "I didn't do this to hurt you," Wren said quietly. "You did that yourself, the moment you decided a lie was an acceptable price for your own bitterness." Serafina's composure cracked, just slightly, just long enough for Wren to glimpse something raw and wounded beneath the elegant surface her sister had spent a lifetime perfecting. "You have no idea what it's like," Serafina said, "watching everyone assume you're the sister who matters, and then losing even that." "I've spent my whole life knowing exactly what that feels like," Wren said. "You just never noticed, because you were never the one it happened to." Serafina had no answer for that, and after a long, silent moment, she turned and walked away, leaving Wren standing alone in the corner of a ballroom that had, for the first time since her marriage began, felt entirely and unquestionably like a place where she belonged. The summons from Lord Edmund Ashworth arrived less than a fortnight later, delivered not as a request but as a demand, disguised in the polite language of aristocratic correspondence. He wished to speak with the Duke, the letter explained, regarding a matter of considerable importance to both families. Alistair recognized the tone immediately. It was the same careful, deliberate calm Edmund had used the day he switched his daughter's names on a marriage contract and dared Alistair to challenge him. He went alone, without telling Wren the true purpose of the visit, though she suspected enough from his guarded expression that morning to know something significant was coming. Edmund received him in the same study where the original contract had been signed, seated behind a heavy oak desk with the same walking cane resting against his knee, the same unhurried patience in his posture. He did not rise when Alistair entered. "Your Grace," Edmund said, "thank you for coming. You made it sound as though I had little choice." "You didn't," Edmund agreed pleasantly. "Please, sit." Alistair remained standing. "Say what you called me here to say." Edmund studied him for a long moment, then folded his hands over his cane. "The clerical arrangement that resulted in your marriage to Wren rather than Serafina," he said, "was, as you correctly suspected at the time, not entirely an accident." The confession landed with less shock than Alistair expected. He had known, in the deepest, most honest part of himself, since the moment he saw the wrong name on that contract, that Edmund Ashworth had engineered the switch deliberately. Hearing it confirmed aloud, however, still carried its own particular weight. "Why?" Alistair asked simply. "Because Serafina is worth more to this family unmarried than she would have been as your Duchess," Edmund said, with the cold practicality of a man who had spent his entire life treating his children as assets rather than daughters. "A more advantageous match has since presented itself. Lord Calloway's heir, whose family holds considerably more influence in Parliament than Ravenswood currently does, particularly given your estate's well-documented financial difficulties." "And Wren," Alistair said, his voice hardening. "What was she worth to you?" "Wren," Edmund said, without a flicker of shame, "was worth exactly what any daughter with no particular prospects and no particular charm is worth. A convenient way to secure a duke's title for this family, without sacrificing the daughter I actually needed for something greater." The casual cruelty of the statement settled over Alistair like ice water, and he understood, in that moment, precisely how little regard Edmund Ashworth had ever held for either of his daughters, viewing them not as people but as pieces to be positioned on a board for his own advancement. "You're proposing to annul the marriage," Alistair said, cutting through whatever careful preamble Edmund intended to offer next, "so Serafina can marry Calloway's heir instead." "I'm proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement," Edmund corrected smoothly. "The original clerical error, once made public, provides sufficient legal grounds for annulment. Your marriage was never properly consummated by intention, only by unfortunate accident. The courts would be sympathetic. In exchange for your cooperation, I would ensure Ravenswood receives a significant settlement, more than sufficient to resolve your estate's outstanding debts. Wren would, of course, be provided for separately, comfortably, I assure you." "You want me to discard my wife," Alistair said, "for money?" "I want you to correct a mistake that was never yours to begin with," Edmund said, his patience finally showing the faintest edge of irritation. "You didn't choose Wren, Your Grace. You've said as much yourself, more than once, to people who have since repeated it to me. This is simply an opportunity to undo an error and secure your estate's future in the same stroke. I fail to see what there is to agonize over." Alistair stood in the quiet study, surrounded by the weight of Edmund's cold calculation, and thought of Wren tending roses that had bloomed again under her patient care. of the tenant families who had sent preserves as thanks for a rent increase she had convinced him to abandon, of the quiet honesty she had offered him from the very first night in the carriage, when she told him she understood he hadn't chosen her, and asked for nothing more than truth in return. He thought, too, of the months since, of a marriage that had begun as obligation, and had slowly, without his fully realizing it until this exact moment, become something he did not want to lose. "No," Alistair said. Edmund's eyebrows rose slightly. "No? I won't annul the marriage, and I won't accept your settlement." Alistair's voice had steadied, certainty replacing the cold shock of moments before. "Wren is my wife. Whatever error created this marriage, it is no longer an error to me." "You would sacrifice your estate's recovery," Edmund said slowly, "for sentiment." "I would sacrifice a great deal more than that, before I treated a person the way you've treated your own daughters," Alistair said. "Both of them. You built this entire scheme believing neither of them mattered enough to object. You were wrong." He turned to leave, but Edmund's voice stopped him at the door, sharper now, the pleasant mask finally slipping entirely. "You understand what this means for your standing," Edmund said. "I have considerable influence, Your Grace. The rumor regarding Wren's lineage was easily corrected once, but I assure you, I have other means of making your estate's recovery considerably more difficult, should you continue to refuse a reasonable arrangement." "Then use them," Alistair said. "I'd rather rebuild Ravenswood slowly, with honest effort, than secure its future by abandoning the one person who has actually helped me save it." He left the Ashworth townhouse without looking back, and though the threat of Edmund's continued interference weighed on him the entire ride home, he found, to his own quiet surprise, that he did not regret a single word of his refusal. Wren was waiting in the entrance hall when he returned, her expression carefully composed, though the tension in her shoulders revealed how long she had been standing there, watching for his carriage. "He wanted to annul the marriage," she said, before Alistair could speak, having clearly guessed the purpose of his visit the moment he walked through the door, so Seraphina could marry into a more useful family. "Yes," Alistair confirmed. "And you refused." "I did." Wren studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and Alistair found himself uncertain, for the first time in weeks, of what she was thinking. He had expected relief, perhaps gratitude, some visible sign that his refusal had meant to her what it had come to mean to him. Instead, she simply looked tired, guarded in a way that reminded him painfully of the young woman who had first stepped into his carriage months earlier, bracing for disappointment before it arrived. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Because you're my wife," Alistair said. "Because I wasn't going to let him treat you like a debt to be settled and discarded." "That's not enough," Wren said, and there was an edge to her voice now, something raw finally breaking through her composure. "I need to know why you refused, Alistair. Was it because you actually wanted to stay married to me, or because refusing your father-in-law felt like the right thing to do, regardless of what you actually feel?" The question caught him off guard, precisely because he recognized, immediately, that it deserved a more honest answer than he had yet given her. "I refused," he said slowly, choosing his words with the same careful honesty she had always demanded of him, "because the thought of this house without you in it made everything else feel meaningless. The estate, the debts, all of it. None of it matters the way it did before, because somewhere in the past few months, without either of us intending it, you became the reason I wanted to fix any of this at all." Wren's carefully guarded expression finally cracked, something vulnerable and hopeful breaking through months of careful distance. "You should have said that first," she said, though her voice had softened considerably, "instead of making me ask." "I know," Alistair admitted. "I'm not accustomed to saying things like that aloud. My father wasn't a man who spoke of feelings, and I was raised the same way." "Then it's a good thing," Wren said, closing the distance between them, "that I have no intention of letting you stay that way." He reached for her then, and she let him, and for a long moment they stood together in the entrance hall of Ravenswood, no longer strangers bound by a clerical error, no longer two people simply enduring an obligation neither had chosen, but something closer, finally, to a partnership built honestly, deliberately, on truth rather than duty. But the danger Edmund Ashworth represented had not disappeared simply because Alistair had refused his offer. Within days, whispers began circulating once more through London's aristocratic circles, subtler this time, harder to trace directly back to their source, but unmistakably aimed at undermining Ravenswood's fragile recovery. A trade partner unexpectedly withdrew from an agreement Alistair had spent months negotiating. A banker who had recently extended the estate's credit began asking pointed, uncomfortable questions about Ravenswood's long-term stability. Small setbacks, individually explainable, but together forming a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. "He's making good on his threat," Wren said one evening, reviewing the latest correspondence from their increasingly nervous trade partners. "Let him try," Alistair said, though the strain of the mounting pressure was visible in the tightness around his eyes. "We've survived worse than Edmund Ashworth's petty influence." "Have we?" Wren asked, not unkindly, simply honestly. The estate was already struggling before any of this began. "We can't afford a prolonged fight with a man as connected as my father." Alistair set down the letter he had been holding and looked at her directly. "Then what do you suggest?" Wren was quiet for a long moment, thinking carefully, and when she finally spoke, there was a steady determination in her voice that reminded Alistair, once again, why he had come to trust her judgment so completely. "We stop reacting to his moves," she said, "and start making our own. If he wants to fight this through influence and reputation, then we build enough influence and reputation of our own that his efforts stop mattering." It would not be a quick or easy solution, and both of them understood the effort it would require. But for the first time since the confrontation with Edmund, Alistair felt something other than defensive dread settle over him. He felt, instead, the steady resolve of two people facing a difficult future together, no longer separately enduring their circumstances, but genuinely partnered in overcoming them. The months that followed tested Ravenswood in ways neither Alistair nor Wren had fully anticipated. Edmund Ashworth's influence, though never openly declared as hostile, continued to work quietly against them, souring potential trade agreements, planting doubt among wavering allies, and ensuring that every small victory the couple achieved came only through considerable effort. But where Edmund had once relied on the assumption that neither of his daughters possessed the strength to resist him, he had badly underestimated the woman Wren had become since her marriage began. Wren threw herself into the estate's recovery with the same quiet, determined competence she had shown from her very first morning at Ravenswood. She cultivated relationships with the tenant families whose loyalty Alistair had once nearly sacrificed for short-term profit, and their support, freely given rather than coerced, became the foundation of a reputation for fairness that slowly began attracting attention among merchants and traders who valued honest dealing over aristocratic prestige. She corresponded carefully with Lord Hartwell, whose earlier doubts about the household had been thoroughly dispelled by Alistair's public defense, and whose subsequent goodwill proved instrumental in securing new trade partnerships to replace those Edmund had quietly undermined. Alistair, for his part, began attending Parliament with a renewed sense of purpose, no longer simply enduring his duties as a distracted, grieving heir, but engaging seriously with the political relationships that could genuinely secure his estate's long-term future. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that colleagues who had once viewed him as a struggling, financially embarrassed duke began treating him with greater respect once they observed the genuine, hands-on effort he and his duchess were putting into Ravenswood's recovery, rather than the empty appearances of stability so many aristocratic families relied upon instead. It was slow work, unglamorous and exhausting, built from countless small decisions rather than any single dramatic triumph. But by late autumn, nearly a year after the wedding neither of them had chosen, Ravenswood's finances had stabilized enough that Alistair could finally settle the estate's most pressing debts without relying on Edmund Ashworth's poisoned offer of assistance. The final confrontation, when it came, arrived not through Edmund's continued scheming, but through Seraphina herself. She arrived at Ravenswood unannounced on a gray November afternoon, considerably less polished than her previous visits, her expression carrying none of the practiced charm Wren had grown accustomed to seeing. She asked to speak with Wren alone, and after a moment's hesitation, Wren agreed, leading her sister into the same garden where the roses, now dormant for winter, had bloomed so beautifully months earlier. "Calloway's family broke the engagement," Seraphina said, without preamble, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "2 weeks ago, they found a more advantageous match elsewhere apparently, and decided our family's usefulness had run its course." Wren said nothing at first, uncertain what response her sister was seeking, uncertain even now whether Seraphina had come seeking comfort or simply somewhere to direct her anger. "Father is furious," Seraphina continued. "He blames me, of course, says I should have secured the match faster, before Calloway's family had time to reconsider, as though the failure was entirely mine to bear alone. I'm sorry," Wren said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it. Whatever cruelty her sister had shown her over the past year, she recognized, watching Seraphina now, the same exhausted defeat she herself had carried for most of her life, the particular weariness of a daughter who had never been valued for anything beyond her usefulness to her father's ambitions. "Don't," Seraphina said sharply. "Don't be kind to me. Not after everything I did to you. I'm not being kind for your sake, Ren said honestly. I'm being kind because I understand, better than most people, what it feels like to grow up in that house, believing your worth depends entirely on what you can provide someone else. Serafina's composure finally broke, the careful mask she had maintained for years crumbling into something raw and unguarded. I hated watching you become someone he couldn't control, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. You were supposed to be the sister no one noticed. And instead, you built something real with your Duke, while everything I was trained for turned out to be worth nothing at all. It wasn't a competition, Serafina, Ren said gently. It was never supposed to be. Father made it one, Serafina said, from the moment we were old enough to understand what we were being prepared for. They stood together in the quiet garden for a long moment, two sisters who had spent their entire lives shaped by a father who valued them only for their usefulness, finally recognizing, however painfully, that the resentment between them had never truly been about each other at all. What will you do now? Ren asked. I don't know, Serafina admitted. Father is already speaking of new arrangements, new families to pursue. I don't think he'll stop, regardless of how many times it fails. You could stop it yourself, Ren said, refused to be positioned like a piece on his board any longer. Serafina looked at her sister with something between disbelief and cautious hope. And do what instead? I have no skills beyond charming rooms full of strangers. I was never taught anything else. Then learn something else, Ren said simply. It's not too late. I certainly never expected to end up managing an estate's finances, and yet here I am. It was not a complete reconciliation, not immediately, and the wounds between the sisters would take considerably longer to fully heal than a single conversation in a winter garden could accomplish. But it was, undeniably, a beginning, the first honest exchange either sister had offered the other in years, built not on their father's expectations, but on a shared understanding of what it had cost them both to grow up beneath his calculating ambition. Edmund Ashworth's influence over Ravenswood's affairs diminished steadily in the months that followed, weakened both by the estate's genuine recovery under Alistair and Ren's careful stewardship, and by Serafina's quiet withdrawal from her father's schemes, a withdrawal that left Edmund with considerably less leverage than he had once wielded so confidently. He never fully reconciled with either daughter, remaining, until the end, a man more comfortable calculating advantage than offering genuine affection, but his power to threaten Ravenswood's future faded with each passing season, until his name became, at last, little more than a distant and largely irrelevant concern. By the following spring, exactly 1 year after Ren had first stepped into Alistair's carriage as a stranger bracing for disappointment, Ravenswood's gardens bloomed more fully than they had in over a decade, the roses she had tended so patiently through neglect and uncertainty, finally flourishing in full, vibrant color. Alistair found her there on a warm April morning, kneeling among the blooms with the same quiet concentration she had brought to every challenge since her arrival, and he stood for a long moment simply watching her, struck, as he often was these days, by how completely his life had transformed since that mistaken signature on a marriage contract he had never intended to sign. You look thoughtful, Ren said, glancing up at him without pausing her work. I was thinking about the day we met, Alistair said, settling onto the garden bench beside her. You told me, in the carriage, that we understood each other because I hadn't chosen you, that it would make things easier. I remember. I think about that conversation often, Alistair admitted, because I don't think either of us understood, at the time, what we were actually agreeing to. Ren set down her gardening tools and turned to face him fully. And what do you think we were agreeing to, looking back? Alistair considered the question carefully, watching the morning light settle over the roses she had brought back to life through nothing but patience and quiet determination. I think, he said finally, we were agreeing to build something honest, even though neither of us knew that's what we were doing at the time. I didn't choose you, Ren, not at the start, but I choose you now, every day since, and I intend to keep choosing you for the rest of our lives. Ren's eyes softened, the last remnants of the guarded wariness she had carried since childhood finally, fully dissolving in the warmth of a promise she had never expected to receive, let alone believe. That, she said, reaching for his hand among the blooming roses, is worth considerably more than anything my sister was ever taught to offer. They sat together in the garden as the morning stretched into afternoon, two people who had begun as strangers bound by a stranger's deliberate mistake, and had become, through months of honesty, hardship, and quiet devotion, exactly what neither of them had ever expected to find. Not a duke and duchess bound by obligation or convenience, but two equal partners who had chosen each other freely, deliberately, and completely, long after the choice had first been made for them by someone else entirely. The wrong sister, as Edmund Ashworth had once so carelessly called her, had become, in every way that truly mattered, precisely the right one.